Just about everyone thinks planning is out of date and needs root and branch reform, but ask people to give examples of what's wrong, and many revert to rather vague recollections, but little by way of detail, with government now looking to streamline the planning system and the much-publicised rejection of an application by Kell Properties on the old Newson site. Perspective talks to architectural historian Peter Kelly, planning chair David Ashford MHK, and Kell Properties representative Michael Josem. Michael Josem explains his interest.
My name's Michael Josem. I'm involved in various community organisations, and so my primary interest here is as a millennial who expects to live on the Isle of Man for the next 50 years or so. I think one of the most important things we do is that we address the housing crisis. Unfortunately, over the last 15 years, the number of houses being built per year on the Isle of Man has fallen in half, and I think it's really important that we have enough housing and shelter for humans to live in happily, healthily and successfully.
And are you representing Kell Properties in some way as well?
Yeah, so I've served as a representative of Kell Properties who wanted to reinvest and rehabilitate what many people know is the former Newson site down on the Quay in Douglas.
And in terms of redevelopment and building more houses, what do you think is fundamentally wrong, if anything, with the planning system?
Well, fundamentally the problem is that we don't have enough houses in our towns, and we have seen that in the context of this discussion and consideration to rebuild and rehabilitate the former Newson site, in that here's a site that is, the building is literally falling down, it is literally decrepit, it is literally an eyesore, and it's really important that if we are going to build enough high quality, environmentally sustainable homes, then we need to do that, and that requires building the things, and there's no other way. If we want to put a shelter over people's heads, we need to have enough homes for people to live in, and that is, I think, the key challenge, because I think the people of the Isle of Man have so much potential, and I want to leave a better place for my children and my future grandchildren, because I think it's really important to build a better future for the Isle of Man.
Peter Kelly, you've had a very active interest in buildings over some years. Do you want to give us a little bit of a flavour of how you speak with some level of authority on these topics, and then we can move into the topic of the day about the planning system.
Right. Well, I'm Peter Kelly. I hope to live here for the next 50 years. And my involvement with buildings and planning goes back to when I started to serve my articles on the 4th of January 1965. So I had 57 years experience of the planning committee or committees and planning system, I suppose, on the island. I am quite used to proposals coming forward to modernise the planning system. Going back to 1965, it was a straightforward thing. There were no fees or anything. You put your plans in, filled in the form, and probably a month later you got your results. And the way it worked within the department was that the plans were stamped up as received, they were put in an envelope, and on the front of the envelope they wrote what the application was. And then when the planning officer, and there was only the head planning officer and one assistant at one time, then two assistants, would look at it and write on the front of the envelope, recommend approval, conditions, and write the condition, and that was it. That's all they did, and then you got your result. As time has gone on, it's a bit like, I suppose, in the nursing profession now, that nurses say, oh well, if you're a sister, you're a ward manager, and you've got all this paperwork, and this is what happens in the planning. Things take an awful long time to go through, or can do, because there's a lot of paperwork. Now, there's reference there to Newson's. The building officer who dealt with it, the planning officer, wrote a 56-page report on that application. And you don't write a 56-page report in a day, so times that by several, and that's what's been the delay. Sometimes it does mean that things are looked at thoroughly. Some years ago, they brought in a fast-track area, which was basically the promenade over as far as Greensal's Corner, Strand Street, back and in Victoria Street. So any application that came in for there was fast-tracked, or supposedly. Some years ago, I queried in the planning office what happened to the fast-track system. What fast-track system? It was forgotten. And I don't know that it ever actually worked. So there have been these attempts to improve things. But what has happened? Another example, bringing in permitted development. So with permitted development, if you want to put a shed up or a greenhouse or something, then you don't need planning permission unless you're in a conservation area. And then there are certain requirements. Putting fences up in front of your house, if it's over a metre, then in the front, yes, you do need permission. If it's behind the building line, you don't. But I'm noticing more and more in the planning list each week that there are applications for sheds, and there are applications to turn a window into a patio window, which again, under the exemptions, were exempt. But it just seems that I think it's a case of if you ask, do I need permission, you're told, well, you better apply. But what the permitted development has resulted in, and this is changing the subject completely, buildings have been extended. You can have a solid extension, not just a lean-to, on it up to a certain area. So when they have been done, they miss the system of getting passed on to the rating office. So there are houses that have got bigger and still rated the same as they were, and local authorities have been missing out, etc., because of this relaxing of the system. But that's a diversion, I'm afraid. But it's hard to say how you could improve it, other than taking away some of the tick boxes. And if you take that away, then you may be endangering yourself of things going through that perhaps shouldn't.
David Ashford, you've taken over the relatively easy and politically hassle-free role of being chair of the planning committee. What I suppose people might think from the title is that you have abilities way beyond those that you actually have. In reality, as chair of the committee, you do just that. You chair the committee. I suppose you can make recommendations to political colleagues who have responsibility for things like planning policy, but ultimately you are there to follow the policy that is set and the law of the land.
Yes, I mean, these jobs seem to follow me, Phil. I always seem to get the good posts. In relation to being chair of planning, you're quite correct. It's a very different role to sometimes the way people perceive it to be. So it is being purely that chair in the committee, and you are one vote on that committee. You have a casting vote if the rest of the committee's tied and it's equal. But other than that, you are one vote. And my role is slightly different as well to what it's been previously, because you mentioned there about planning policy. Certainly in recent history, the chair of the planning committee has also been the political member in DEFA with responsibility for building control and also planning policy. I haven't actually joined DEFA. I've purely actually become chairman of planning. But in some ways that makes it freer for me to speak out about planning policy in general, something that I've had quite an interest in for a long number of years, even back to when I was on the local authority on Douglas Council. And I've had some quite ingrained views on the way I think planning needs to move forward. I think at the moment the system is overly bureaucratic. I think Peter was quite correct when he touched on the fact that people go into the system and then they seem to get stuck. And there seems to be an awful lot more paperwork and paper trails following things than personally I believe is necessary even in a modern planning system. And I worry that actually we put off developers, because Michael made a very good point as well, which is why, one of the things we need to do to drive forward is to build the houses of the future. If we are going to grow the population, as is government's ambition, to 100,000, we need not just family homes, but we actually need homes that are affordable as well, and that will have to come from new builds. And if builders and individuals feel that they're not getting what they want from the planning policy, they won't come here. It's as simple as that.
One of the last conversations I had as planning minister with a very prominent developer on the island went along the lines of, actually, the planning system, the Isle of Man, is much freer and much more likely to deliver us swift results than any of the planning systems that we use across the water. Is it sometimes just like one of these things where politicians just know that somehow the planning system is the problem, but they can't really put their finger on specifically what it is that they think the problem is?
Well, I've been quite clear in what I think the problem is. I mean, I think certainly we need to incentivise more around brownfield sites. Brownfield sites, particularly some of the ones in the Douglas area, can be very difficult to develop because they're already built on different sides. So there's not really an incentive there for developers to go for those sites. I think we need to incentivise that more. We need to have more permitted development, I think, in that side. If you speak to developers about the system in the UK, one of the things is that depending on where that developer is, they get different results, because we have to remember that in the UK, first stage planning rests with the local authorities. And I speak to developers who operate here and also in the UK. And I think what frustrates them in the UK is they get a mixed system depending on which local authority they're dealing with. Some local authorities in the UK at that first stage planning are very efficient in pushing things through, and others are, you'll go round and round the circle time and time again. So I think one of the things developers do like over here is they are dealing with one system and one central authority rather than the mix of authorities in the UK. But that doesn't mean we can't improve the system here. I think we can improve the system. I think we can get rid of a lot of the bureaucracy that's in that system. And I think actually that would be welcomed by planning itself as well, because I think we've just been adding to things over the years, and planning is one of those areas where I think we need to completely look at the legislation again as well. The Town and Country Planning Act, all the regulations, the environmental policies, everything that flows off that. Because if you go through, there is very much a bias to environmental policies and everything else, but there's not much about economic growth in those policies, about economic benefit. And I think we need to be building that into our planning system as well if we're going to move the island forward.
And Phil, I think that point that you made there about big developers being happy with the existing Manx planning policy, I believe you 100%. Right, because I can see that it is so complicated that what seems to be happening is that there'll be big developers and they will submit one plan and they will get it approved, 200 copies of that over and over and over again. And we see that on the outskirts of Castletown at the moment where such a complex is being built. And so that makes it difficult for a small developer such as Kell Properties, which I'm obviously associated with. And here we have a situation where they're a small operator, they're looking to build 5 or 6 apartments or 10 apartments, I think it is in total, in the centre of town. It's a niche proposal for a small and complicated site. And so therefore that's why it takes 8 months for this to even be heard before it even gets to the planning committee. So because, as Peter was saying before, someone's got to write 56 pages about it. And it's silly. And leave aside the bureaucracy here. One of the things that we need to consider is that there's a real cost of these delays. And that cost is unreasonably and unfairly being borne by the young families on the Isle of Man in their 20s and 30s because they're unable to find a home. They're unable to therefore build a family, to have kids and to build a family and a life here on the Isle of Man. I have friends who as a couple, they move into their parents' home so they can save up money for accommodation because they are unable to afford a deposit because there is such a excessive constriction of the supply of housing. And that's why in the last 15 years, the number of houses being built here on the Isle of Man just to replace the existing stock has fallen in half. By 15, when you used to build 400 homes a year, now we're only building 200 homes a year. And there's a real cost that is hidden for young families right across the Isle of Man.
Just focusing then on the Kell Properties and the development on Newson's, which really was what drew my attention into this, as well, of course, as the government's economic strategy, which references in a fairly vague and overarching way that there needs to be some change to planning, but it doesn't really specify exactly what that change needs to be. But we'll maybe come on a little bit more to that as we go through the programme. Specifically then, what was it that Kell Properties felt that was wrong with the planning system in relation to this particular development?
So there's two parts of that. First of all is the process. It took 8 months to even get a hearing. And then after the hearing came through, obviously Kell Properties, as the advocate of the proposal, was disappointed with the outcome, which was the rejection. And so we had a petition of 520 people that signed a petition to redevelop and rebuild that site. Anyone in Central Douglas or anyone across the Isle of Man knows that the building, can see the building is literally falling down. And so I guess that's the two parts of this. One is, we've got to protect those things that are truly valuable, but there are some things that are old and that is different to being valuable. And so there are really beautiful buildings that we need to protect and preserve here on the Isle of Man, but that is a different group of buildings to those that are merely old.
But in relation to this building, presumably when it was bought, it was in the state that it's currently in, was it?
Yeah, so it was bought some years ago. It was not at that time a registered building. It was subsequently registered, and now we're left with that as it is.
And do we know why it was registered? I mean, maybe
so the application form is very, very clear on that, in that it was registered as a building because it was old. The application to register the building does not even attempt to make the argument that it is a beautiful building or it is a valuable building, but it does make the argument that it is an old building. And old things can be good and old things can be valuable, but not all old things are valuable. And that's what I think we need to differentiate here on that particular site, in that the building has had no maintenance for 30-something years. It was literally falling apart. We have rats there, we have plants growing out the side of the thing. And so we need to differentiate between those things that are merely old and those things that are valuable.
You're listening to a Perspective Planning special. I'm guessing, Peter, you may have a slightly different take on this.
Right. Well, buildings are registered principally for two reasons. One is their age and rarity, and then the other is their architectural importance in terms of what they offer to the streetscape or designed by a famous architect or whatever. Now, the trouble is, the registration document just merely says it is registered because of its architectural importance or its age and whatever, whereas on the file there is probably not a 56-page report, but a several-page report going through what is important about it. And with Newson's, to the best of my knowledge, the importance was its age. It's built in the 1700s, and there's only one other building in Douglas that goes back that far, which is in John Street. It is, and always has been, a warehouse. And it's different to all the other warehouses that there were on the quayside, which were gable end on, in that this was flank on, and the only one of its case, and the last warehouse left on Douglas Quay. So as far as I know, that was the reason. Now, in terms of its condition, as you say, when it was bought, or as Michael said, when it was bought, it was in the same condition as it is now or thereabouts. There have been reports on the building. One of the earlier reports, which Kell Properties actually had done, pointed out the growth, the need to point between the stones, etc. But none of that has been done. It doesn't have windows, it has shutters. And ever since then, the shutters have been wide open. So when it rains, thunder, lightning, whatever, it all goes in, soaks into the floor, soaks into the joists, etc. There's been no effort to preserve it in any shape or form. In terms of falling down, again, there was a report came forward saying it's in imminent danger of collapse. And 8 months later, it's still there. It hasn't
That's because
connected.
of these great big trusses that are put up in the street to hold it up.
Yeah, no, they're not holding it up. Did you not know?
They are holding up.
No, they're not holding anything up. If you look, they don't touch the building. They're up in front. Now, if the building was falling, between the steelwork and the building, you would put in wooden wedges. All there is are little wooden boxes out of 6x1, which goes through. If the building moved, they would just collapse. And it is not being propped up. The report which Kell Properties had done referred to there was a weakness in the back wall and in the southeast corner, which was on the corner of the little shop. Neither of those have been propped up. what's been propped up is what's seen by the public, except it's not propped up. It's there. And what was said at the planning meeting, I was at it, by the engineer was, it's there in case the building should move forward, then it would catch it. Now, anybody who's dealt with Manxstone, and I know you've built in Manxstone, Phil, will know that if a wall is going to go and move, you're not going to stop it moving by touching it in a couple of places, because the whole wall will just belly out and go. So it's a little cosmetic in my mind, all this propping on the front.
Michael, you want to come back in on that? Or?
Yeah, look, the building is obviously decrepit. And so any listener to this can go down and have a look at the state of the building themselves. It is plain and obvious for people to see. And then, I think the next step is how do we make the best use of the centre of Douglas? And that building is the only one left, because in that whole region, people have found better and more productive uses for that land. In that you have so many great restaurants down there. You have the family-friendly Barbary Coast, you have the Little Fish Cafe, you have the 14 North, these great places that celebrate a whole range of entertainment. You also have Just Pizza and Pasta, where families go and enjoy. And so that's a whole stretch of properties that really should be the jewel in our crown. And instead, we have this building where tiles are at risk of falling off, where there is, clear risk and clear opportunity to make it better. So we leave something better for the next generation.
Is there, though, I mean, maybe it's just me, but the thought of going to a restaurant which you could describe potentially as being in a building from the days of the smugglers seems to me to have some level of attraction to it. Is there any value in heritage in the world in which you hope to live in the next 20 or 30 years?
So I think there is, but I think we need to be returned to the actual realities of the building, that it is crumbling, it is unviable in its current state to be used. There's obviously a whole bunch of requirements relating to disability access and so on. There's a whole bunch of requirements in regards to the safety of buildings and walls staying up. And so ultimately, if you want to run a restaurant in an elderly building, then to pony up the money. But in the meantime, there are other people who have looked at the building. They have considered and submitted ideas to rehabilitate the building, but found that when it gets to the nuts and bolts of it, it's not viable because of the decrepit state of that building. There was a planning application that was approved 3 or 4 years ago. But it never went ahead because it turned out that it wasn't possible to do the rehabilitation in a manner that was safe and viable. And so that's why I think it's really important. If it's all this talk is all well and good, but here's a guy who's put up, wanting to put up £8 million of his own money to invest in rehabilitating that site. All this talk is wiffle waffle by others of I would have, I should have, I could have, or whatever is nonsense, because it's not. There's no skin in the game. And so if you want to, I think that really comes down to the real core point here, is that we need to move on, in that the site, if we wanted to rehabilitate it, that would have been a good argument or good conversation point when Peter started his career back in the 1960s. That would have been a good thing, because that probably would have been possible before the building decayed. But now we've had this building, no one's really cared for it for more than 30 years. If we were living in 1980 or 1990, we could do something about it. But now we're living in 2022, and that time has passed.
David Ashford, then, I mean, is there a role for history in the future, or is that all past and gone now?
No, I think there is. I think there is a role for history, and things can be repurposed. We've actually shown that across the island with various different buildings over the years. But I'm quite literally sat in the middle here, and I think I am actually in the middle, because I think both Peter and Michael both have valid points in the fact that you don't want to lose all the history. You don't want to end up with a montage of just pure glass modern buildings everywhere. But equally, you've got to look at whether a building is able to be repurposed. The phrase I always use is all history started somewhere. Like when people talk about Tynwald, the Vikings made a big change when they brought Tynwald in. It was a new system of government, and there was probably people at the time saying we don't want this newfangled Tynwald thing. So there has to be a balance, but I don't think we should lose sight of our history, and I think it is right that in the planning laws the historic value is actually considered. But the difficult balance, and this is what you referred to at the start of the programme, Phil, is where do you put that balance? Where is that tipping point between what is of historic value and what is being maintained simply because it is historic? And for me, that difficult balance has always come down to looking at things on an individual merits basis. I think it's very hard to have one catch-all policy, and it is something planning struggles with. I mean, I can't speak, being chairman of planning, on individual applications because it will then conflict me, because mine's a statutory role about anything going forward. But of course, when there's been some of these debates, particularly around certain buildings, the planning committee itself's been split, and there's been split votes on planning, with some thinking a building can be retained, others thinking it can't. And I think that's something you'll never remove from the planning system. I think there will always be controversial applications from the point of view of and split opinions on both sides, and I think that's what the planning system's there of in those cases, mediation. But certainly, it shouldn't take 8 months for applications to get through the system and actually before a committee, because as Michael said, there's a cost to that. And there's people who have put money up front to try and develop things, and we need outcomes early on. So again, I come back to the point where, for me, planning reform is more around the bureaucracy of the system, and also making sure that there is potential weightings in terms of economic growth and encouragement of brownfield site use.
Is part of the problem here that government wants to have its cake and eat it, in as much as, I think most people in the Isle of Man recognise the value of heritage.
We all do.
I don't think there'd be many people, for example, who would suggest that Castletown can solve its parking problem by knocking the castle down and building a multi-storey car park. So, at some point, everyone is on board with heritage, but gradually over the distance of arguments, you'll find you lose people along the way. But government wants to have legislation to protect historically important buildings. But unlike a number of neighbouring countries, we don't put any money up to actually help people, property owners like Kell Properties, to actually preserve these buildings.
Again, though, I think it's a fine balance, because otherwise you could end up with an awful lot of public funding going into private property owners' hands to try and maintain buildings that they've purchased. Now, obviously, people can purchase a building and then it can end up being registered, as has happened on many occasions. We've just been speaking about one of those today that can put then pressure on that particular property owner. I think, like I say, for me, as both an MHK and an individual, it's about that fine balance. And the fact something is old doesn't necessarily make it historic. And I think it's having that recognition in the planning system, and it's then balancing it off around economic benefit, environmental benefit, and where does that fine balance go? And that's one of the reasons we have a planning committee. So we have a committee of lay people who can actually hear all the evidence from both sides, a bit like a tribunal or a court, really, can hear the evidence from both sides and can come to a informed opinion from their point of view as to which way it should go. Now, sometimes that will go one way and sometimes it will go the other. And basically, what I think planning is always one of those things, a bit like health and social care, really, where whatever decision you take, you're bound to upset someone somewhere. And there's never going to be a right solution for everyone, because it always is, at the end of the day, deciding you either agree with the applicant or you agree with the objectors.
Peter Kelly, I was talking in I forget which programme it was now, a few weeks ago anyway, to Kirsty Neat from Manx National Heritage, who was talking about the, is it the centenary of the museum? Or 100?
It's the centenary of it moving into the building
into
it's
that
in.
Building,
I mean, the museum's been going since 1886, but it was 1922 when it moved into the old hospital.
That'll be the one. And at the time that they were talking about moving in there, the the people engaged, the greats of Manx heritage were being told by people, well, there's nothing on the Isle of Man. We don't really have much by way of heritage. There's very little of merit in a poverty-stricken place like the Isle of Man. And yet, in the age we live in, you could argue the opposite. That actually, maybe we've got too much heritage, and perhaps that's where government's coming from here.
Well, I don't know about having too much heritage. You've got to... I mean, I know of planners in the past, they're long since retired, and some of them have died, but each year plans weren't considered during August. There was a break during August, and these planners would go off to... planning schools, refresher courses, and they'd come back and say, oh, wonderful buildings in Chester, wonderful buildings. We've nothing like that here. Well, this is where you've got to say, well, hang on, what is the best of what is here? Because you're not going to get a half-timbered building here. You're not going to get a Yorkstone church or minster or whatever, and you've got to judge it on what's here, and then set your criteria as to what's important and what's less important. Old buildings have been demolished. In fact, streets of old buildings have been to one side of Albert Street has gone. Now you've got a courthouse there, and part of Bucks Road at the same time. So no, you can't keep everything. You've got to decide why, and there is purpose in registering buildings. It goes through a process. Now, when it's decided within the planning office that this building, should be considered for registration, there's a little press notice saying the planning committee are considering registering nuisance or whatever. That gives the opportunity to the public to write in and say, jolly good idea, we support that, or the owner to say, no way, I don't want it. Then they make the initial decision, not to register, but whether it's worthy of registering, and then it goes forward and goes through the process in office as to whether to register or not. And then when it's registered, the notice is served on the owner and to the local authority. This building is now registered, and the owner has 21 days, I think it is, in which to actually appeal against the registration, and it can go through then to an inspector to decide whether it was worthy or not. In this case, none of that happened, in the sense there was no objection to, there was no appeal. So the owner has actually accepted that the building was registered.
The owner overlooked that paperwork, unfortunately.
Sorry?
The owner overlooked it, just didn't notice that paperwork when it came through, which is unfortunate, because you're right, it should have been debated when it was listed.
Yeah. Well, if he overlooked it, I mean, that's his fault. But what I'm saying, there is a system, and the system was followed. And with any registered building, once it's registered, you have certain things in which you have to comply with, including what has happened here, that the department, I don't know whether David knows, served a notice saying, right, you own a registered building, you need to do the following repairs, which haven't been done, and now there's a court case next month with an appeal against the notice that was served. But we're getting too much into detail there. But with any other registered building, you have to comply with these requirements, which again, if you make a planning application for a registered building, you have to make two applications. One is the standard planning application, and the second is a registered building. And I have known of cases where a registered building has received planning approval but has not received registered building consent, and therefore the thing can't go ahead. Can I just go back to housing? And talks of numbers of housing less and less. Going back several years, half the houses that were built each year were local authorities. Now, I ask you, how many local authority houses are getting built?
Very few. 12 last calendar year.
Yeah, Douglas Corporation, you see, and quite rightly spending money, a lot of money, on refurbishing the housing stock. Onken commissioners have been spending money on refurbishing. The last, I suppose the last local authority houses Onken built was in fact 4 years ago, but it was just a couple of flats down in the corner of the park. But in terms of large scheme, the local authorities haven't looked ahead and bought land. the land has been bought by the developers. And the developers are probably three of them are the ones who are the ones being referred to. They had the foresight, and they did exactly the same as L.L. Corkle, the late L.L. Corkle, did in the 1930s. He bought the land around Douglas and Onken. He owned the House Drake. He owned out Tremode. So he knew eventually, and he didn't live long enough. He lived till he was 90 or so, but he didn't live long enough to benefit from his foresight, but others have since then. But certainly in terms of houses being built, there are three developers who are building the houses, apart from the odd one that's squeezed in between building plots, but local authorities aren't.
David Ashford, is it purely wishful thinking on government's part that the 15,000 new people that are supposed to be coming to the island are all going to live in properties refurbished or rebuilt on brownfield sites?
No, it's a mix. Government policy is, I've got to be very clear, Phil, government policy isn't that it will just be on brownfield sites.
It's hard to get any minister committed to give numbers on what might be built on greenfield.
Well, you can get a former minister committed.
Right, okay.
Is that obviously there isn't enough brownfield sites to accommodate all that, and some of the brownfield sites, particularly in Douglas, will lend itself more to flats rather than family homes, and also affordable housing needs to be done as well in order to encourage many people in. But the point the government makes is that it's got to be a mixture. We've got these brownfield sites there, and it shouldn't be an automatic turning to a new land. We should be trying to encourage and develop. And the Manx Development Corporation, I know, has been doing a lot of work in this area. We're already seeing some of the repurposing of the nurses' home. People are able to physically see that in action. I know they've got a lot of schemes ready with other sites as well that will hopefully be able to be announced. Personally, I hope very, very soon, because that work was underway when I was Treasury Minister, and that will actually then start developing some of the other brownfield sites. But it does have to be a mixture. But I think what always sticks in people's throats is when they see lots of fresh land being developed, when they see what are these eyesores sat around areas such as Douglas, such as Onken, that haven't been developed. And I think if people are seeing a mixture of the two, then that's actually when they'll begin to understand that, we're going to be able to put the services in place to attract people in. But housing is absolutely fundamental. There hasn't been enough development of fresh housing, particularly affordable housing. And Peter's right in terms of the local authorities, and even those few local authorities that have been built, so Mike refers to the 12 in the last calendar year, most of that is replacing existing stock. Even where it is a new build, they physically knocked down and rebuilt. So for instance, Janet's Corner, when that was done, was replacing stock that was already there. It wasn't a complete new build adding to the number of local authority houses. And we're going to have to, if we're going to move forward as an island, have a mix of all types of housing. I've always said the housing debate always comes around first-time buyers. It's not about first-time buyers. It's about first-time buyers, second-time buyers, even downsizing. I have constituents up in Douglas North that will happily want to downsize, but there's nowhere for them to downsize to. They can't get the bungalow that they want without paying an excessive price. In fact, I've got one constituent where the bungalow they want to downsize to is actually of a higher value than the house they're actually in, which is crazy because they want to be able to pass some of that money on to the children and can't do so if they go to downsize. They'll have to find additional money. So it's about all that mix, and also having first-time buyers and local authority schemes as well. We need to look at housing policy across the piece. And you'll know yourself, Phil, from when you were a minister, the obsession is always with first-time buyers. And we need to get over that obsession and look at our housing planning across all of the different types of housing stock.
Yeah, and I think David is really spot on there in making the point that we need a variety of housing for a variety of different families, in that the nature of families living on the Isle of Man and their housing needs has changed substantially over the last quarter century. We see people getting married later, getting divorced sooner. And so what might have previously been a home for mum, dad and a couple of kids, now you have separated families, and so dad wants a house for dad and the couple of kids, and mum wants a house for mum and the couple of kids. And so there's a great big increase in the demand for housing. In addition, more people are working from home, which is causing further demand for people to have a spare room or some sort of office sort of type area. And in addition, people are living longer. And so all those things mean that despite the population being relatively stable for last little bit, there is an increasing demand for housing, and so that's why we have a real trade-off here. In that, if we want people to be able to live happy, healthy lives, then we need to build shelter for humans to live in.
Just finally, on the well, maybe not so finally, in relation to planning applications, I mean, there aren't that many rejected, are there? As I recall, when I was planning minister, there would be maybe something in the region of 100 applications a month, of which maybe 4 or 5 appeals that I would have to consider as minister. So there's not that many applications really go to appeal, and there's very few applications actually get rejected.
There is, the percentage is very small, but I think actually, though, it's more the perception, because, of course, those that tend to be rejected or are controversial and come before the planning committee are the ones that tend to get the most media attention, tend to get the most public attention, because there's objectors to it. There's also supporters on the other side as well. And so they're the ones that tend to play out in the newspapers, on the radio, in the public sphere. So people are more, are sort of more brought into the process for those applications, where you're right. And in fact, in terms of general applications, there's, the vast majority are actually decided outside of the planning committee. The vast majority are officer decisions around things like permitted development and things that don't actually need to go as far as the planning committee. So that's why I've always I've been talking about the process behind that, because a lot of the delays are the actual process themselves and the hoops that people have to jump through. We need to be making that easier for people on both sides, both as objectors and also for the applicants themselves.
And Michael, I mean, in relation to the Kell Properties application, having read, which I did, the planning decision, what was pretty clear from that, certainly from what I was reading, was that Kell Properties just didn't provide sufficient information to convince the committee that it was worth, or there was a strong enough case to actually demolish what was a registered building, or what is a registered building. Yeah,
and so I think it's unfortunate that the planning committee made that decision. Disagree strongly with that decision, and so in the aftermath of that, the company had been intending on selling the property and saying, look, this is too hard, we'll let someone else do it. But then in subsequent to that, there was quite a significant outpouring, to our surprise, in that, although we were mindful that there were over 500 people who signed a petition in support of the development even before the planning committee, the comments that we received from people on social media, even listening to callers into the Manon line, listening to personal messages of support and so on, in that we think that the planning committee got it wrong, in that we think that the centre of Douglas should be an icon, not an eyesore. And so in that sense, that's why we're now appealing against that decision, and that appeal will be heard through whatever the right procedures are.
So I mean, what reasons would you say you gave as a property developer that would warrant effectively demolition of a registered building?
Sure. So the reason to do it is that, first of all, it creates a better environment for the people of Douglas, because it's about improving that. First of all, in terms of the hospitality trade, that whole area of North Quay and Douglas used to be known as the Barbary Coast, not named after the pub, but rather because there used to be a whole chain of fun and engaging hospitality outlets, and so that was on the ground floor. And then on the upper floors, the plan was to build a number of apartments. They would probably not be first home buyers, but they would rather be an attempt to make almost last home buyers for people who wanted to live in the centre of town. It was designed with a manner that was very environmentally sensitive, and so it was about using local and high quality building material with a low carbon cost, and to also, by virtue of being right in the centre of town there would be little need for driving and all that other associated.
But you must have known that the building was registered. So you put in the application. You know that to overcome the registration and effectively demolish a registered building, you have to give pretty sound and strong evidence to support your application. So what was that information? What was the evidence that you provided?
Yeah, so the evidence is provided, first of all, the opportunity, the potential to build something better for the future, and then second of all, in terms of considering the value of the building as it is. it's our view that building has relatively little value, as demonstrated by the fact it's falling down, as demonstrated by the fact that no one else has wanted to do anything with it for more than a quarter of a century now. And so we think that there's an opportunity there to do something good. And we think that is a compelling case. And, I accept that the 5 members of the planning committee voted 3-2 against it. But the planning committee does not contain all the knowledge in the world. They are not perfect humans. We think they made an error, and so we disagree with that, and so now we will go through that appeals process.
But the planning committee also followed the advice that was given to them, as I understood it anyway, by the
they made
officer.
Judgments. They're humans. They made judgments based on their evaluation, and so I recognise deeply that there is a balancing that needs to be made there, and that reasonable humans can have differing views, and that Peter here was a reasonable human, and we value these things differently. That's not wrong. It doesn't mean that Peter is a bad person. We just balance these things differently, and so I consider, the opportunities to rehabilitate North Quay in Douglas. I consider the opportunities to build homes for humans. I consider all those things versus what I see. Just as a layperson, I'm not no expert on building construction and so on, but I can see as a layperson that site has been decrepit for a long time now, and we can do better, because I think the Isle of Man has such a bright and positive future that we should build so that we build buildings so that in 100 years' time people can look back and say, hey, look, wasn't it good that in 2022 they built this great building that rehabilitates this site in the centre of Douglas, that creates jobs for humans, creates housing for humans, and makes Douglas a place that we want to build our life and to create families in.
Peter, good to know that you're a reasonable human.
Well, yes, you have to tell my wife that.
Maybe we'll have to get the wife to testify at the next planning committee hearing.
Okay.
Yes. So I mean, of all the buildings that we could be discussing, this is probably not top of the list in terms of the need for preservation, or would you argue differently?
The nunnery is not registered and should be, right? This is registered, so we have to treat it as being registered. You were leading Michael into, but he didn't follow it up, that the planning committee, to a great degree, their decision on their officer's recommendation. And of course the department had engaged an engineer, well-qualified engineer with old buildings, who said, no, it's not going to fall down, you need to repair this, you need to repair that, and so on. It was interesting to sit there and see the planning committee and the 2 that voted in favour. Now, one of those kept saying, is the red brick building part of it? Now, there is no red brick building, and the plan's on the screen. There was no red brick building. And another one who voted in favour said that building at the end, which was one of the 2 the far side of what used to be the paint pot, are those the corporation flats? And you're sitting there thinking, they don't understand it. They're not understanding the plan. And they voted in favour. But that's the way it goes. There are plenty of buildings out there still which have not been registered. This was registered for a reason. Whether you agree with that reason or not, it is registered, and therefore, if you want to do something with it, you need permission. If you want to have it deregistered, you have to go through a process to have it deregistered, and then maybe it frees you up. The problem, as I saw it, with the application was it covered several properties. Now, if they had applied separately for these 2, for the merchant's house, as it's now called, the paint pot as it was, for that, and then the gap separately from the end, then you probably had 2/3 of your application approved. But they didn't. They put it in as one. So having gone in as one, it fell as one. The chairman of the planning committee did point out that media, advertising, advertorials, petitions, online petitions, are not considered by the planning committee. they deal with what is before them, and he made that quite clear. And it was interesting that the head of planning, who was there, actually said to the committee, you have to consider this building as if it were in a good state of repair.
That was architectural historian Peter Kelly, planning chair David Ashford, and Kell Properties representative Michael Josem. Any clearer on what needs to change? I'm Phil Gorn. Goramayo Sungeishakrom. Thanks for listening.